Good evening. I'm Greer McGeary, President of Seahorse Victoria, and my guest tonight is Madison Moffat. Welcome, Madison.
Thank you.
One of the traditions I've had in the conversations I've had with individuals is sort of asking, when did you first realise that you weren't or were different?
Realising that I was different is certainly a different question to when did I realise I was trans. And I think I've known since I was old enough to think a question like that as to whether I was different, that I am different. And I have memories as a really small child, really wanting to sit in a box. And there was a particular box, for a few months it was in the living room, and it stayed there because I wanted to stay in there. And what I wanted to do, and I did, was I would pretend to read, because I was way too young to actually read. But what I would also do is I'd listen to certain music that my mother used to play, and she was very much into Motown and certain other movements which were like girl bands and the like. And I sort of remember, although way too young to actually remember, there's almost like this feeling that I do recall thinking that I was them, that the voice was my voice. And I was not a little Warwick, which was my name at birth. I was a little Dusty, as in Dusty Springfield, or a little Dion, as in Dion Warwick, as it happens. So, there's actually pivotal moments in my childhood where I describe them as situations where the penny could have dropped, but it didn't.
I've had a similar sort of feeling of not being able to articulate it, but as a toddler, where, it wasn't anything that mum and dad did in specific, because little kids like dressing up. But I had that sense that little boys aren't supposed to do this. So there was no sort of thinking, oh, I really want to be a girl, but I know there's something different.
So that little box experience, I was about 3, which is why to a certain extent I discredit the idea that I have a solid memory of it. But I do recall, for instance, being rather proud at the age of 5 that I had curly hair like this. And I was mocked for it by some of the kids, because short hair was in. Even though it was the 70s, I was living in country New South Wales, so short hair was in. And I remember defending it because it was my life, it was my hairstyle. And so that then came the chant and retort, Warwick and his hairstyle, and I was livid. And I was livid because, yes, it is a hairstyle and I like it. And I kind of sort of knew, though, that this was not typical, for a boy.
So did you, in that sort of, I suppose, teasing, did you sort of consider it as being bullied or just sort of teasing?
Yeah, unfortunately, I really did take this stuff to heart. And although on another level, it's not really that unusual for a child to be, and it's always some child's turn to be teased, isn't it?
That's true. Yeah.
But I internalised it so much to the point where, by my teen years, I actually had an exceptionally negative idea of what the world thought of me, and so therefore what I was going to think of it back.
So you're going from primary school into secondary school.
Yes.
So were you, before we get to that sort of first thoughts about being trans,
yes,
were you into sports or anything like that, or the typical male type activities?
I found that because I used to play with balls a lot in the backyard against walls and the like, and I was quick to respond, that I actually had a bit of skill when it came to soccer. And I do recall that one of the levellers, during a period where I think without this I might have been in a bit of trouble in the playground, was that I was actually quite good at soccer. And I also recall one of the children getting their parents, who was a coach for one of the soccer teams, to actually come around to my home and request that I be part of the team as a result of this, prowess that I had displayed in the school playground. And that was a leveller, for as long as it lasted. I'm not quite sure why, but in early teen years, I really lost interest. And I think it might have, to a certain extent, been the ever-increasing macho element of sport.
Growing up and going through different stages, and we all have our own stories in that, but because you've had a sense of being different and now you're getting into, you've had a turn at sports and being sort of accepted, as it were, in sport. Did you sort of, at that point, feel that you were developing your own real sense of identity, or was that still later to come?
Well, I think one of the tragedies, if I may call it that, might sound a little melodramatic, is that what I learnt as a small child was sense of self was not the point. It was, I learnt impression management, as they call it, very early on. So sport became a way of me being accepted, and that was the point. As for sense of identity, I think one of the elements that has been so troublesome right up to and including late adulthood until very recently is I don't actually believe that I properly considered what myself was. And in fact, it was just dangerous territory, and I had to completely avoid that idea.
That's a hindsight looking at yourself. But
Yes.
at the time, did you sort of feel as though you had good parental support or school support for just you as a person?
I did feel, rightly or wrongly, that I was not understood. I felt that that my parent, I even had this feeling, which I know was incorrect now as an adult, that my parents disliked me. And I don't actually think that was true at all. Indeed, I can think back as an adult and realise that there were people in the school environment, teachers and even a principal at one point, who were clearly behaving with care. And yet my perception at the time was that I was hated by these people in authority. And so over time, as I've already alluded, I took on this sort of punk notion that, you know, the response was to hate it back. And I would really explicate that and really act that out from time to time, the more I led into adolescence.
So at that point there, is it you start to sort of think, I may be more female than male, or did that still come later?
I would allow myself certain proclivities, if you will, in terms of the way that I would present myself as I led into adolescence. But this was the early 80s, early to mid 80s, so one could always pretend it was fashion. You know, so yes, that jacket did look a bit flowy, but have you seen what Martin Kemp from Spandau Ballet wears? It's not that flowy.
Yes.
And we all know how butch Martin is. So, you know, and that became an ever-increasing, I'll say it, excuse for how I would dress. So at one point, I decided I was a goth. There was absolutely no social reason to believe this about myself. I had no goth friends.
So at the time, you're developing the punk goth look and, you know, in a sense, giving the sense that people are against you.
Yes.
Is that impacting on your studies and the subject matters and things that you're taking on, considering, I'll be leaving school and I've got to do something in the future?
Yeah, Greer, what studies?
Yes.
What are we talking about? Yeah, I clearly haven't conveyed to you the type of youth that I was. Look, the report cards, I do believe at one point, just for a joke, the teachers of each subject decided it would be funny to repeat it, right? It would always say, because again, this was my name, Warwick is a gifted student who will not apply himself. And that was just and you know, as a matter of fact, on reflection, that was fair. As to whether I'm gifted or not, I'll leave that to others. But as to whether I applied myself, that was a fair assessment. And it was Defiance. There was even a major history, Year 9 history assignment. I believe it was indeed the only assessable item for the entire year. It was to construct a family tree and bring your own observations to that. And I happily informed this just devastated teacher that I had not done it when it was due.
particularly through my teenage years, I had similar sort of comments about, I've got the ability but don't really apply it.
Yes.
And that I found myself sort of just drifting in a sense, things happen. Oh, yeah, right, I'll go on and do that now, rather than sort of actively either opposing or trying to go in some other direction.
Well, this was a general trend for me, and it was quite worrying right up until when I left school. And I left school in part as a way of opting out. I would opt out of things because I wasn't always necessarily perceived by people as and I use this term freely, as queer. But I would have that accusation levelled at me. And let's face it, in the 80s in high school, if you weren't, it wasn't suggested that you were queer, you were being accused of being queer. And I was aware of that, so of course I stringently denied it. But yeah, there was just this overall attitude that I took, and I even intellectualised it at one point, which I am wont to do. And I remember thinking to myself in my bedroom, I don't know what it is about me in particular, but it's there and I'm hated for it. And I'm going to hate the world back.
So you're really not even thinking of being trans, that's a trans issue at that point. You're just, something's not right with you.
Well, there was an inkling there that something was up. Something was up. One only had to look at my bedroom walls to see that, Gender queer was certainly a theme. And I wanted to be like these people. And even though I would not focus on that aspect of what they were doing in saying so, I would be clear that I wanted to be those sort of... I was distraught at one point when I realised I wasn't going to be able to go to England for a student exchange because, let's face it, I was the last person they were going to choose to exchange to some poor British school. I would have just caused an enormous amount of trouble.
Well, you might have been able to fit in over there.
Perhaps. But, in reality, it was probably a very wise choice because the plan was for me to actually then leave immediately for Soho and try to find this particular group called Sig Zig Sputnik, who were probably the most gender queer group in British pop at the time. The lead singer literally had a catchphrase: the higher the hair, the higher the heel, the higher their income. And again, very strange. I would have these inclinations and yet I would never quite mentally make the connection.
So you talked about their sort of having a real interest in this alternative style of music.
Yes.
So were you musical yourself?
No. No, I was an appreciator rather than a participant. And to a certain extent, I think that was also an extension of opting out. Where I was enthusiastic about something, I couldn't quite fathom that maybe I could join in, but I could observe.
Just step back a little bit. So you've left school, you had the opportunity, potential opportunity to go to England, and you're looking at the gender queer music and the likes there. So having left school, all that sort of background you've had so far,
yes.
How did you cope when you left school? Did you go to university? Did you get a job or what?
So I was working part-time in a Mexican restaurant, and where, although I'd be the butt of jokes, I seemed to be somehow accepted. So I actually decided I was going to work full-time there and leave school. And my father turned it into something a little more formal. He decided it needed to be an apprenticeship, and it's like, fine, we'll make it an apprenticeship. But the whole point, quite frankly, was to escape the school environment. And as soon as I did that, I started dressing somewhat more outlandishly. So we're talking about, pretty studded, bootstraps on things, and much more flowy jackets and hair that was very much in the 80s bouffant style, And again, though, clearly, Greer, this was in the name of fashion.
Of course.
Of course.
Of course. So you're sort of really starting to push a public persona of yourself.
Yes.
How did you manage to then develop a relationship with somebody to eventually get married?
I became by that stage more mainstream. So I decided on a number of occasions that I was a number of things. So what we've been talking about was when I decided I was a goth, right? And then later I decided I was a mod. And by the time that I'd met Christine, I'd decided that I was a raver. So yes, there was a rather colourfulness to the jackets again. It was always about the jackets, Greer. And it was a parachute silk, peppy jeans, bomber jacket with on-point purple and black collar, and, you know, so it did not look particularly straight. But on the other hand, I don't think my wife-to-be was the sort of girl who would have minded, you know. She did have queer friends back in her high school environment, for instance.
So was she into fashion like you were?
I don't think anyone was. I don't think anyone, you know, and part of the tragedy was the low income just didn't mean that I could purchase half of this stuff anyway. And, you know, perhaps for my own safety, it was for the best, because I always liked the outlandish stuff, you know. This is really sweet, thinking back. After only a few months of living in a spousal relationship with my wife-to-be, and we're separated, but we still very much care for each other, she must have picked something up, because she said to me, you know, if you wanted to wear a dress, that would be perfectly fine. And I've often thought, why did I then respond to her by saying, well, I would never do that? Oh, why wouldn't you? Because I'm a man, in terms of, you know, her saying I could always wear a dress. That was in part because I've spoken with her quite recently about this, and we reflected on it, and it was in part because I used to religiously buy the Face magazine. And it had spreads on it, where kids were wearing kilts, you know. They'd talk about the Blitz kids and as a history, and then, you know, the club kids in New York that had happened a little later. Jean-Paul Gaultier's, you know, dresses and gowns for men. And apparently, I don't quite recall this, but apparently it really did strike Christine as to how open I was, you know, to this sort of stuff. And then there was the fact that I would constantly be wearing, in the Queensland heat, a towel around me, as if it was like some kind of skirt. So I think that in combination with also, again, I don't recall, but apparently we had encountered in public from time to time trans and gender diverse people, as we would now refer to them, and I just clearly didn't mind it. And I think it's also this openness and some of those interactions where we'd be sitting together reading these fashion magazine collection that I had, where she popped the question. And I kind of reflect on, why did I insist to her that it's because I'm a man? I would never do that. And I think the answer again is I was allowing myself to be an observer, but I could never be a participant.
Yes, and I must admit, I had sort of similar sense in my own self, you know, like, because my daughter has said that, you know, like I was Mr. Responsible.
Oh, yes.
And, yeah, I participated in all the things that, you know, like when you get involved in service clubs and the like, and you take on roles of committee and leadership roles and all that sort of stuff. But similar sort of sense of refusing to acknowledge or even to dare to cross the line and be that participant as you describe it. You know,
yes.
Like I had a strong sense of me standing behind my own mask.
That resonates so strongly.
I created a good facsimile of myself.
So yeah, I mean, another element. I was once a goth, I was once a mod, I was once corporate man. So, you know, in my role, and by this stage, I'm firmly embedded in risk management, occupational health and safety, environmental management, and to a certain extent, community, community awareness. And I had become someone working for either directly or indirectly for companies like ExxonMobil, you know, and other, you know, global giants, and this was now my element. And I think that, you know, I was always searching for something other than the dangerous alternative that was actually me. And I touch on this because of your comments around being Mr. Responsible, and I just thought, oh, that's corporate man for me. You know, and you know, I think I was actually responsible, and I think these days, even though I'm openly trans, I'm still responsibly working in that sort of ethical type of work, and it still suits me. But it's no longer, again, a form of denial.
And I think that was, in my own case, once I sort of started to deal with the issue openly, that it made it so much easier. You know, like I still get on well with my ex, and but she tried to get me to deal with it, go and see somebody, talk about it. And I'm going, no, I can overcome this. And
yes. I have the gumption.
Yes, but that sort of then comes to something we've been alluding through the whole conversation so far is the mental health aspect of what you're touching on and how the differences impact every individual. So, do you want to comment about how it's impacted on you?
Yeah. When I was in high school, I was forever in and out of the counsellor's office, for instance. And there was a point there where, unfortunately, at about 14 years of age, it became clear that something I had done was for the intent of harming myself to a point where it might end my life. And I was brought to the attention of someone who worked for the local council, who worked, however, in schools, being essentially like an escalated counsellor. And I recall him actually asking me, as if it was pertinent, after many, many sessions, and I had come to trust him to an extent, did I think I might be, and this, he edged around it for a bit before asking directly the question, but did I think I might be like those people? And the people he described were people who are either in terms of sexuality or in terms of what we now refer to as gender, being gender diverse, aren't quite like everyone else. Did I feel that I might be one of those people? And I denied it. And again, it's just, by this stage, the penny was starting to drop. And it was actually, you know, an offer for help, and I refused it. And throughout my adult life, there would be points of crises. And I would always behave as if these crises had something to do with other than the gender stuff, other than sexuality. But looking back, it's just so clear that that was connected. And unfortunately, by 2017, I actually ended up in the intensive care ward for a private mental health hospital. And I was in the intensive care ward for a few weeks before I was then discharged into one of their open wards. And I was in a serious state. And although at the time, again, not aware of the cause, by the time I went back home, it had become very clear to me that this was all about me having concealed, even from myself, in a way that just caused such turmoil that at this point I described it as, I am not male. And I didn't quite know what that meant, and there was a lot of exploration after that, but that was key. And that also that I am not heterosexual. And so it turned out that all this time, a lot of the trouble that I was having, and I'd be diagnosed with all sorts of things. You know, back then they call it having an emotional disorder. Now they call it anxiety and, you know, a tendency towards acute depressive episodes. Who knows what they'll call it, Greer, in the future?
Labels, and we've touched on labels throughout the conversation. You know, like being the goth and the mod and the rave. Yes. And very similar is that there seems to be a sense that you've got to have a label to do it. And I must admit, it's similar to you. Fortunately, I haven't had to go through anything like that. I've had family members that have had issues, but in my own personal sense, I've been able to maintain a fairly straightforward and blindly go through life, I suppose.
Yes.
But that sense of I don't necessarily, at the point of up to then, I'm neither male nor female. I'm just me.
Yes.
That was the way I sort of looked at it. I don't, even though I much prefer to present openly like this,
Yes.
I'm not somebody who's desperately saying I am one or the other.
Yes, I see. So with me, what I have found, and unfortunately this is contrary to what I had been advised by certain psychiatrists, so I've had to reject their advice. I found that if I present more like this, indeed, after having chosen to take hormone replacement therapy, so I'm feminising my body and also myself, there seems to be some emotional and psychological element that HRT assists with me, for me as well. These rather acute mental health issues have all but subsided. It's almost a miracle cure. It's to an extent where sometimes I find myself, questioning whether I've considered this to be a panacea for all ills. But it does still nonetheless appear that these serious health issues that extended as recently as, say, early 2020 have dissipated just as a result of trying to be who I am to such an extent that, believe me, Greer, the work that I'm doing at the moment, it's challenging and it's socially challenging. And you are constantly being challenged, including by colleagues who actually like you. You know, you need to be constantly on your game, not just professionally or technically, but also in terms of interpersonal interaction and being robust in asserting your views.
Yeah, because being robust, that's really a critical aspect of just being a human being, is having that resilience or the robustness to ride with the punches occasionally, but having the courage to talk about the issues. So you're finding that you're able to more openly discuss your issues with other people?
Yeah, I mean, issues of all kinds, at all levels, yeah. My part of hiding who I was to hide any sense that I needed anything from anyone. And of course, what that results in, Greer, is no one helps you.
That's right.
No one helps you. And people are often shocked then when you have, some people call it a breakdown, but I think it was a breakthrough, but nonetheless painful at the time. And people are shocked. You know, they will have the impression that the last thing you needed was help and the last person who needed help was you. But it's part of denying who I was denying how I feel. I'd be asked by professionals, okay, you've described what you think about what we're talking about. How do you feel about it? And I would seem to be almost completely emotionally illiterate. It wouldn't be just that I couldn't describe it. I couldn't delve in and find the answer. That has changed. I will cry at puppies and do so happily.
And so from 2020, when you really, in a sense, had that big breakthrough moment, I suppose.
Yes.
So what have you been doing for the last couple of years to be yourself and be involved in the things that you wish to be involved in?
Part of what I've been doing is working out what I am actually inclined to do rather than deciding that I'm going to apply what is just another set of gender-based normative expectations. So, and some of it's very practical, like what do I actually think of makeup? And the answer is I own it, but I rarely wear it. You know, and previously I thought to myself, this is something I must learn and this is something I must get good at. And then I've realised, meh, no, okay. You know, I'll wear it from time to time. So there's been a lot of personal work with almost, I'd say, thousands of little things like that. You know, it's turned out that clothing, on the other hand, is very important to me. And I seem to almost completely buy into gender normative expectations with regards to dress. But I'd like to think that, at least in part, that's because I actually enjoy that clothing.
I think there is a sense of being able to openly give signals to other people, this is who I am.
Indeed, indeed. And as we've discussed, be it to provide a facade, or be it to actually authentically, or at least attempt to authentically present who you are, clothing's been a big thing for me. Yeah. The other thing that I've found, and I think that I'm lucky that the community I've found myself in as a result of these epiphanies is a community that is quite community focused, because as a result, I just kept feeling encouraged to start engaging with organisations, often in a similar capacity to how I engage with employers, helping out with some of the more administrative and organisationally focused challenges that organisations like Transgender Victoria have. But also getting engaged in peer support, not as an organiser, but definitely as a participant. I've been recently involved in a queer writing group. You know, I have found that community is giving me the connection that I rather suspect without it I would lack still.
Do you have much of a vision of where you will be in a few years' time, or for the rest of your life?
One of the funny things about all of this too, and part I think of being in a mode of self-denial, I was actually at one point throughout my life, actually, until I turned 45, convinced I'd die at 45. And I'm not quite sure what that was about, but it was part of fatalism. And I think part of the residual result of that is I still haven't quite grasped the idea that I might actually live to be 60 or 6 or even 70 or maybe even 80. And so I do actually find it hard to project that, to think that through. My answer, which is clearly wrong, is, more of the same. It clearly isn't going to be. I'm going to change. We all change. Or maybe in part, it's just the whole punk aesthetic of no future.
How I see it for myself a little bit every day is something a little bit different, something a bit new, something a bit old, aspects of it. Being a little bit older than you, that, sort of, I got to consider a little bit, I may need to make other arrangements in the family life sort of thing. But I think it's the sense of evolving as a person. Yes. And being open about it without, you don't have to be an obnoxious person to be, noticed in public.
I am more myself, and I think that does come across. I rather suspect that in the past there was always some notion that there's something about them, as in myself, that's being concealed, and that actually makes it difficult to even have deeper relationships of trust with people, which is terribly important in social and in working life. And I think just being more myself, being able to engage, sometimes in humour, sometimes in inappropriate humour, about who I am, but all in good sport, has actually resulted in being able to more quickly develop mutually beneficial and somewhat more authentic engagements with people. And I just find that to just be utterly beautiful. My life is just becoming beautiful rather than a burden.
I think on that very positive note, thank you for being my guest tonight.
Most welcome.
I'm Greer McGeary. Thank you for watching Bent TV. My guest has been Madison Moffat.